Hello and welcome to 2-Minute Talk Tips. I'm Bill Monroe. Today's tip, use a lav correctly. A lavalier or a lav is a small microphone that typically clips onto your shirt or onto your collar. If you're in a situation where you have to use a lav to speak, first, when you're using a lavalier, you turn at the waist. So when, for example, you want to look towards the side of the audience, maybe somebody asked a question and you want to focus your eyes over there to give them their attention, you have to turn at the waist. Because if you turn at the neck, then all that's happening is you're turning your head and you're also turning away from the microphone, which is attached to your torso. Second, run the mic wire underneath your clothing. Typically, you'll want to run the wire that goes from the battery pack to the microphone up through your shirt and then come out through some buttons or something like that. It's all going to vary widely, of course, depending on the specific type of clothing that you're wearing. But you want to make sure you run that wire up through your clothing because otherwise you have an unsightly wire just sort of dangling in front of you. Beyond just the appearance, when you happen to use hand gestures and move your hands around, you increase the chances that you're going to accidentally grab that wire or have it catch on a finger or another object and yank on the microphone. This looks awkward and can make for some unfortunate sounds. Speaking of unfortunate sounds, that brings us to number 3. And that's, remember, your microphone is always on. Now, of course, the sound technician at the event may have muted your mic input so nobody can hear, and you might have flipped the switch on your battery pack / transmitter to turn it off. But you should never assume it's turned off. You can find plenty of stories of people who accidentally transmitted through their microphone because they thought it was off when it was, in fact, on. This can lead to some embarrassment if you're having a private conversation off stage that accidentally gets picked up on mic, or if you do something like head to the bathroom while your mic is still on. If you want to be sure that it's turned off, I recommend unplugging its cord from the battery pack that sits on your belt. Stick around, and after the break, we're going to talk about some lessons that we can pick up as speakers from Star Trek Discovery. So this evening, I just finished watching the first 2 episodes of Star Trek Discovery, the new Star Trek show, obviously. And I gotta tell you, I'm really enjoying it so far, but that's not really the point of this discussion. You can hear more about my thoughts on Star Trek Discovery on this week's episode of Caffeinated Comics with John Clark. And you can find that link in the speaker notes for episode 29 over at 2minutetalktips.com. Of course, there are a number of lessons for speakers in the current episodes of Star Trek Discovery, and I'm going to talk about a few of those this week. Don't worry, I'm going to avoid any major spoilers. But there are 4 key points that I want to talk about this week. And that's first, light the beacon. Second, it's unwise to confuse race with culture. Third, you cannot save lives that have already been lost. And fourth, you find stories where you look for them. So first, let's talk about light the beacon. One of the Klingon leaders uses this as a rallying cry for his forces as he tries to unite the Empire. You see, he recognizes that a simple mantra that his audience can rally around is a powerful thing. And when you have a large audience, you can often get them chanting something with you. Often they'll chant simply because you told them to, or simply because you challenged the right half of the audience to chant louder than the left half, and then the left half has to beat the right half, and vice versa, and it goes back and forth. Using your position of authority on the stage to tell people what to say works surprisingly often, and it's really amplified when you can amp up that competition within your audience, because everybody wants to win, even if there's no prize to actually win. They're just chanting louder for pride to show that they are the louder half of the audience. But there are other things that happen while you've got them chanting. You've also built a commitment to your cause when people state they support your cause. And when you've got them chanting, you've got them stating their support out loud in public. To disagree later, those individual audience members would have to admit to themselves that they were wrong in the first place. And I've become convinced more and more that the hardest thing for people to do is to admit that they were wrong and to admit it to themselves. I think that explains a lot of what we see in the news these days. And it's a force that you can use to your advantage as a speaker. But beyond the chanting and the public agreement and the commitment that your audience makes, the other advantage is how a simple mantra helps with retention. Especially in a smaller group where it might be a little more challenging to get them chanting. Generally, the chanting is easier in a larger audience. But that simple mantra makes it easy to give them something that they can latch onto, a key phrase that they will remember from your presentation. Remember, the further and further your audience gets away from the time of your presentation, the fewer and fewer details that they'll remember. Part of your job as a presenter is defining what the audience members will take away. What is the key thing that they will remember? And a recurring phrase is simply going to be more memorable. The Klingon leader in that episode said a lot of things to the Klingons that were standing around him. And I got the general gist of what he was saying, but the only phrase that I specifically remember is light the beacon, because that's the phrase that kept coming up again and again. So do you have a phrase that runs through your presentation? If not, is there one that you can find? Maybe it's for chanting purposes, or maybe it's simply for memory. But a simple mantra like light the beacon is something that your audience can remember. The second lesson I want to take away from this episode of Star Trek is a quote from the first officer to the captain, and that's, it's unwise to confuse race with culture. Now, she was speaking specifically about some of the learnings and her experience with the Klingons, but for speakers, it's important to understand that your audience can vary widely, and you don't want to make incorrect assumptions about your audience. For example, it might be easy to assume that one audience of salespeople is going to be the same as another audience of salespeople. But in reality, the culture within that sales organization can vary widely from one company to another. And making assumptions about that culture and about that audience based on just knowing that they're salespeople is going to give you a flawed result. And making those assumptions about your audience without actually double checking is a great way to misinterpret them and to ultimately miss the point with your audience. So before you draft your talk, take some time to understand the audience, especially if you don't personally know those audience members already. Ask your contact at the organization to tell you more about the audience, such as what do they care about? What are their priorities? Are there any hot button issues that they have at this point in time? What do they know about your topic? How are they likely to feel about your presentation? Is there anything else going on in the company or organization, for example, recent layoffs or a recent expansion or buyout or any other major things happening to that organization that could impact how your audience is feeling on that day? Ask those questions ahead of time and don't confuse race with culture. The third thing I want to take away from this episode is a quote from Vulcan Ambassador Sarek as he's speaking to Starfleet Commander Burnham. You cannot save lives that have already been lost. As speakers, we tend to really believe in what we say. Or, at the very least, we really ought to believe in what we say. We can take that very personally. Unfortunately, no matter how convincing we are and how effective our presentation is, from time to time, we just won't convince everyone. I know, this world would be a much better place if everybody just always believed in what I said and did what I said as soon as I said it. But unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately for nearly everybody else's perspective, that's not quite how the world works. And yet there's a temptation to continue working on a point that we've already lost, to try to win over the audience on that point. But continuing to do so has two problems. First, it annoys the audience because you're already telling them that they are wrong, and they really just want you to move on at that point. The other problem is that focusing on a lost cause takes time away from the points that you could win. and from the goals that you could achieve, all to waste time on something you're never going to get a positive result from. There's no shame in focusing on the points that you could win and walking away from the ones that you can't. Carefully choose the arguments and points that you want to focus on, because you cannot save lives that have already been lost. The fourth lesson I want to take away from this process is that you find stories where you look for them. On Sunday afternoon, I wasn't sure what I was going to talk about this week. I had a whole bunch of ideas and a bunch of topics sitting in a list, but none of them were really feeling right this week. And then I realized that Star Trek Discovery was premiering, so I decided that afternoon that I would just extract content for this episode from the premiere. I was confident that if I kept my eyes open, I would find things in Star Trek Discovery that were going to benefit speakers. You see, what happens is that when you tell your mind to look for something, generally you find it. For example, when you get a new car or a new-to-you car, you suddenly notice all of the other cars of the same model that are out on the road. Or even if I just point out that there are a whole bunch of red cars out on the road this month, all of a sudden you're going to notice a whole bunch of red cars out there on the road this month. Whether it's true that there's any change or anything different doesn't matter, but because we've been talking about the red cars, and because your mind is now aware of red cars, you're going to be seeing those red cars wherever you go. So another example as well. I was bored one weekend back in the mid-90s when I was living in Montana, and then I saw a flyer that said you could take this 2-day class and leave it with your motorcycle license. So I figured, what the heck, and went ahead and did that. Now, of course, during this class is still the first and only time I have ever actually ridden a motorcycle, but it was still a fun class. And one of the things they talked about in that class, and they had us practice in that class, was how to avoid obstacles. And what they told us was that to avoid obstacles in the road, don't look at the obstacle, because your mind will hit what you dedicate resources to. Your mind will hit whatever it is you're focusing on. If you want to avoid that obstacle, that pothole, that piece of debris, that pedestrian, whatever it is, instead of looking at that obstacle, you need to look at the path around that obstacle. And you need to look for that path. And because you are consciously telling your brain to look for that path, that's what your brain will see. Your brain will find the path around that obstacle, and you will avoid it. Because when you tell your brain to focus on something, it will focus on it. If you focus on the path around the obstacle, you'll hit that path. If you focus on the obstacle itself, you will hit that obstacle. The point is that when you get stuck, tell your brain to look for something. When you tell it to focus on something, you'll position yourself for success. When you tell it to look for content, you'll find that content. When you tell it to look for those stories, you're much more likely to find the stories that you want to tell in your presentation. And when you tell your brain to look for content in Star Trek, you'll find content in Star Trek. So that's 4 key things I've chosen to take away from this episode of Star Trek Discovery. Light the beacon. Don't confuse race with culture. You cannot save lives that have already been lost. And when you look for stories, you will find them. Do you like the Star Trek analogies and stories? Let me know in the comments on episode 29 at 2minutetalktips.com or call the listener feedback line at 650-TALK-TIP. If you found this episode to be valuable, please be sure to share it with a friend or colleague. And make sure you're subscribed in your favorite podcast application. So use a lav the right way the next time you need one, and look around at the media and at your world to find the stories that you want to tell. And every day, don't get best, get better.